This weekend, the director's cut of Rebel Moon has dropped on Netflix. So let's talk about it. Hi, my name is Sean, and I love to talk about movies and TV way too much. With that in mind, go ahead and join me down below in the comments section. Let me know, what did you think about the director's cut of Rebel Moon? In particular, several people mentioned that they intentionally did not watch the PG-13 cuts of the film because they only wanted to watch the director's cut, his true version of these films. If you're in that category that you didn't even watch the PG-13 cuts, let me know down below in the comment section. I'd love to have that specific perspective and just to maybe see how much seeing the PG-13 cut might have tainted the experience for some of us because it put such a bad taste in our mouths. Now, as we go into this is essentially going to be a comparative review where it sort of assumes that you're familiar either with the PG-13 version or my thoughts on the PG-13 version of the film and making a recommendation as to whether it's worth checking out the director's cut. Let's get started. So as a starting point, I feel like this 2 cuts of Rebel Moon being released by Netflix was a gigantic miscalculation on their part. Now, Zack Snyder, in promotion for the other versions of the film, made it very clear that essentially they wanted him to make the PG-13 versions of the film as a way to financially justify spending so much money to make the R-rated versions of the film. And he went on to explain, essentially, he's had this idea for Rebel Moon in his mind for decades.
The origins of Rebel Moon, the first time I think had a snapshot of what it could be was, I think it was up at Art Center when I was a student. I had a class on, you had to do like a one-line pitch, you know? And I was like, what about Dirty Dozen, Seven Samurai, but in space? And my professor was like, that's actually good.
And from his perspective, essentially what he was trying to do was tell this Star Wars-esque story, but which just cranks things up to such an extraordinary level that whether you're talking about the violence, the sex, the weirdness, that it almost becomes this commentary on the genre itself because of how extreme it is.
In the R-rated versions of the movie, everything is amplified. The R-rated versions of the movie have a slightly more satirical, the PG-13 movies end up being pretty earnest. They don't have sort of sex and violence to over the top them. That in the R-rated versions, because the violence is so over the top and the sex is so over the top, that the tone changes.
But therein lies the problem with this entire strategy in my mind, because they released the PG-13 version first that removed everything that was supposed to make this project distinct and add something new to the genre and comment on the genre.
I kept coming back to it because I really had something to say about the sort of tropes of sci-fi. I just couldn't get it out of my head that there's got to be a why of it, and how do we break it? It allows the comment on the genre to be a little bit more obvious.
Right.
Where I feel like in the PG-13, it's just more straightforward, like this is a actioner with the sci-fi elements, where I feel like the R-rated version is a little bit just weird.
A little weirder, right?
It's just weird. And you're just really like, oh wow, it makes you think about genre and it makes you think about sort of what's possible in sci-fi and what's not.
So for me, watching the original cuts of the film, they simply felt like generic Star Wars ripoff, where there's obvious parallels to Star Wars, Battle Beyond the Stars, Magnificent Seven, Seven Samurai. Its influences are really obvious, but without the R-rated violence, the weirdness, the sex, anything like that. It's just another PG-13 knockoff of Star Wars that adds nothing new to the genre and where the characters aren't as interesting. It's just a derivative work with nothing new to add.
It's kind of ironic. So I wrote this very extreme R-rated bizarro sci-fi movie to test it.
Right.
But now you've gotten the earnest version first. I'll deconstruct my own movie with the director's cut. So
that's hysterical.
It's a closed loop.
In particular, watching the PG-13 cut, it felt very much like I was watching this these movies that both felt like they were stretching their story out far too long, but they also felt like they'd cut an hour from each of the movies. It was a very strange experience. And the characters fell flat, the plot points felt derivative, and just even in the scripting, it felt so clunky. Part 1 was so cyclical, where they just kept going to a new location, introduce a person and their power, and then move to the next place where we introduce a person and their power, and then we have a final battle and the credits roll. And then part 2 felt like an hour straight of pausing to go, I need to hear your backstory before we go into battle. And then they pause, do a flashback for every one of our major characters, and then we do an hour-long battle. Just very clunky storytelling. So my hope was that with the director's cuts, we would get kind of this properly fleshed out world. He described in the interviews that they're essentially set in a different world. It's a different story because there's so much added in that it reframes everything. And that was my hope going into this. Now, Zack Snyder has a long history of director's cuts for a variety of reasons, where he had movies that he set out to make one movie and the studio decided they wanted to release a different movie and they got changed. This was, Netflix came to him saying, we want to make two cuts. From the get-go, that was the requirement to be able to fund it. And that feels like we're manufacturing a release the Snyder Cut movement. It feels kind of cynical to do that. In particular, because they released the non-true version first rather than the true version. And like, here, also, if you want a family version, we've got that too. Though I don't know who wants to watch the family version of Rebel Moon.
I just saw Rebel Moon Part 2. There's nothing in there that's safe.
Yeah.
And I saw the PG-13.
Yeah, PG-13 is a joke.
And when it comes to Zack Snyder director's cuts, some of them just add a few more extra scenes. Some of them, like the Ultimate Edition of Batman v Superman, tell essentially the same story, but it makes a lot more sense in the proper version, where they cut too much, so it just felt very choppy in the theatrical version. And then you have something like Justice League to Zack Snyder's Justice League, where it is like a radically different experience, where Justice League is like the Cliff Notes version with a bunch of bad jokes thrown into it and tonally inconsistent. And then in my mind, Zack Snyder's Justice League is a comic book movie masterpiece that's just the magnum opus of the DCEU. So, where does this fall in the spectrum of things? Is it worth checking out? Let's talk about it. And I'll cut right to the chase here. The director's cut is my preferred version of Rebel Moon, simply because it feels like a proper Zack Snyder film that's made for adults. It knows its target audience and tries to deliver the experience that was promised. But it also doesn't really resolve any of my issues with the storytelling, or the script. So when you go into it, the part 1 kicks off with a 20-minute cold open that wasn't in the original version at all. And it's a pretty cool little sequence. It's one of my favorite sequences in all of both parts of Rebel Moon, either version of Rebel Moon. It's a really good sequence that's brutal. It establishes the tone, the stakes, makes our villain immediately very menacing, and makes it clear that he is cruel and merciless. But then from there, we go into essentially the movie that we saw before, except when someone gets shot, their head explodes. When they're hit with a sword, their arm flies in the air. When they're punched in the face with a shield, their head explodes. And there's like a gratuitous sex scene at the beginning of it that's, and I mean like gratuitous, like the way that the plot sets this up, it's like, what's going on here? And there's a bit more weirdness to it. There's more kind of creature things, odd things that happen, but not like a dramatic shift. It's not like we really went into weird, crazy mode. It's just a little bit more of it. But when it comes to the actual story itself, it follows the same beats in the same manner. Just sequences are longer. There's a little scene added in here. The flashback goes into more detail. But the structure, the characters themselves aren't radically transformed. The cold open gives us the backstory for like one character, and the that plays into the rest of the story. So you get more background on one guy, and that to an extent informs you of the nature of this tyrannical government and the soldiers and how they're recruited and what he's representative of what many of them might be. But besides that, of the main characters that we had before, I didn't feel like I had a radically different impression of any of them. A little bit more here and there, sprinkled, but not enough to justify adding an hour to the runtime. It's not an hour's worth of, oh, wow, that was cool. Oh, wow, that was a great insight. You get a little bit more, but also it makes it a much more difficult watch. And as I mentioned earlier, the original versions felt like we are watching a movie that both feels too long as well as it feels like it's cutting an hour out of it. So now we're watching the version with that hour added back in, and your thought is, okay, this feels complete, and it feels too long. And the plot here is very derivative, of course, of Seven Samurai and The Magnificent Seven, and then also sort of Battle Beyond the Stars, because that is derivative of those two films. Which, those stories are not 6 hours long. They are a classic samurai film, a classic Western, and they tell it in half the length of what this movie requires and has better characters. And so immediately there's a thing you can look at that tells this story much more concisely. It's not at all clear why Zack Snyder needed 6 hours to tell this story, because the world doesn't feel that developed. It doesn't feel like we know that much about the individual characters, and the way we learn about them is not through giving them subplots and development. It's like they pause to go, well, what happened to me was, and we get a flashback. And that's still true in the director's cuts. That was the issue with the original version. That's the issue here as well. Now, part 2 doesn't have anything like the cold open that part 1 added that was a cool extra thing added into it. It just essentially is a expanded version of what we got before, but with nasty, gory violence. And for that reason, it probably plays better, because part 1's like 3.5 hours long, and there's just no reason for it to be that long. And you don't even know, like, everything just takes too long to get going. Part 2 has the same problems that it had originally, which is to say the first hour is just nonstop slow-mo grain fields and flashbacks. But then you get into the back half, and it's an hour and 20-minute long battle, which is cooler when heads are exploding, body parts are falling off, and all the gore that comes with it. And so it's, for that reason, it doesn't add so much. It doesn't drag down the runtime as much with just so much bloat, though it already is and continues to be bloated, but it's not 3.5 hours long. It's only 3 hours long. But you are watching a big epic battle that plays better in this version, that, with a few extra scenes that kind of explain what's happening a little bit more, and the violence. But once again, the story is not in any way transformed. It's still the same straightforward story that it was before, that fleshes out characters with flashbacks. I think there's a subplot that's kind of added in that adds a little bit of nuance, I think, into it. I don't recall it from the original version, but nothing dramatic, nothing transformative. It's the same movie, but a little bit longer, with some sex scenes thrown in and heads exploding, but not a transformative change. It's my preferred version because I'd rather see a Zack Snyder movie that has the violence the way that he wants it done and has his style to it rather than cutting around his style. But that's about it. That's to say that the PG-13 version is like the made-for-TV version, where they have to cut out the gore and the bad language, and this is the full version. It's that. It's not a transformative new experience the way that he said it was going to be. So what's my recommendation for those of you that watched the PG-13 version? Should you watch the director's cut of the film? And if you're a Zack Snyder fan, you probably should, because this is his proper version. If you enjoyed the other version and want to see the proper full version of it, absolutely check it out. But if you're just someone that checked out Rebel Moon and you went, I didn't really care for that I didn't like the characters, the plot was too derivative, this version does not resolve any of that, you can probably skip this version and you're not really missing out on anything except a whole lot of headshots and a gratuitous sex scene in each part of the film. As I said earlier, and as I said in my previous reviews, I feel like Rebel Moon on so many different levels was a dramatic miscalculation on everybody's parts. And this movie makes me think that Zack Snyder desperately needs to start working with outside screenwriters, where he's got his big ideas that he's excited about, his iconic imagery, themes that he likes, and weirdness. I think he needs to pass that on to stronger writers to give him a script that he can apply his visuals to. Same way that George Lucas passed off scripting duties for Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. He was still involved, but he passed it off to someone that was more interested and put more fine care into the details and were stronger where he was weaker. Zack Snyder really needs to do that with his future projects. Let me know what you thought about it down below in the comment section. Check out my Zack Snyder ranking right over there. Thank you so much for watching, and keep talking movies and TV too much. Bye-bye.